Wow, I have way too many browsers open. I'm like, why is my computer so laggy? Oh, I have like 5 different browser windows open. All right, well, let's just terminate a few of these things. Okay, while I do that, I'm making good progress on the exam, so hopefully in the next few days I should have everything marked. I'm trying as hard as I can to get it back to you as quickly as possible. So we're gonna keep working on that as fast as we can, and as soon as it's up, if you want to review it, we can definitely start working on that. All right, so today, obviously last time we finished up, let's put that there. Last time we finished up talking about crime, right? You did your exam in the first part, or whenever you did. We started talking about crime, and we finished talking about crime and sort of that framework for young people. And today we are going to jump into our second last topic, which is youth and, I have it here, mental health, which I think is going to really nicely sort of dovetail into our final topic, which is looking at some of the arguments made by Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Anxious Generation, which has all sorts of really, really interesting stuff on, what's going on with Gen Z in particular, and some of the challenges, and especially how it relates to technology. So it really is kind of a technology unit. Okay, so this class, hopefully about half of it, we're going to look at youth and kind of questions of mental health, and we'll just talk about some of the kind of trends that are going on and some of the things that are maybe a little bit more worrisome when it comes to Gen Z and kind of their mental health. And then we're going to kind of pivot from there into kind of another, because it's spring, another documentary, which is called The Social Dilemma, which we'll watch, through the end of this class, and then if there's any left at the beginning of next class, and then we'll go for, and it serves as a nice little bridge between this topic and Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. So we will, finish up with that today. So hopefully we'll do about half and half, talking about mental health and talking about, and watching the documentary. Sorry, and then next class. And then the final class will be all about Haidt and then some final exam sort of review. All right. So, okay, I guess I should have put that up right away. I'll leave that up for a second. So that's basically the agenda for the rest of the class. Amazingly, the course is almost over, and I feel like we just started. That's always how spring feels a little bit. It's like, oh, right, we started this like, what is it now, 5 weeks ago? And now we are almost done. Okay. So, mental health. And I mean, when I had this unit in the past, right, it used to be a kind of a broader health unit with regards to young people, right? And included things like obesity and eating disorders and sexual health. And a lot of that was really relevant when it came to millennials, right? When it came to millennials, a lot of these things were the big challenges that millennials were facing, and teen pregnancies and these sorts of things. Drug use, traffic accidents. Increasingly with Gen Z, it might just be the sources of information I turn to, but also I feel like the discussion when it comes to the health of Gen Z has increasingly kind of switched into talking specifically about their mental health. So this unit for me has kind of morphed in lots of ways into an overall kind of mental health kind of discussion on the whole. So I want to start with kind of this. And all of this data, so for the first part, comes again from my good friends at the Springtide Institute, right? So these are, we're talking about, Gen Z and religion, right? That was that data from Springtide. And they are a really interesting U.S. research institute in that they've been running polls now since 2018, and they're exclusively kind of youth focused. And as they've gotten more and more funding, their polls are getting bigger and better and all this fun stuff. And every year they put out kind of a book, and the book in 2022 was all about basically connecting with Gen Z. What they said was America's loneliest generation, and this sort of got me thinking. With regards to Gen Z, what are the big questions? Okay, so at the beginning of their own study, one of the things that Springtide talks about is they bring in some other studies to kind of set the tone. Okay, so Cigna, they cite this study by Cigna, right? So Cigna is a big polling group in the US, right? They did a poll in 2018. So again, think of this. This is prior to COVID, right? It's a couple of years prior to COVID. So any COVID effects that you'd be thinking of haven't happened yet because COVID hadn't happened at this point. And they, regularly, Cigna polls, 20,000 US adults, 18 and older. And they did sort of comparisons, generational comparisons in this study. All right, so what did they find with regard to Gen Z? Well, they said Gen Z is the loneliest generation. So when and they did all of this using, what's called the UCLA Loneliness Index, which is sort of the gold standard for judging loneliness. It's, I believe, 15 questions that they use basically to score, how lonely a person is. And so looking at all of the generational cohorts in this Cigna study, Cigna pointed out that Gen Z was the loneliest generation and the one that claimed to be in the worst health, right? So they were facing all sorts of struggles, rating their health as poor, and especially rating their mental health as poor in lots of ways. Now, one of the things that Springtide brings out is they say social media use alone was not a predictor of loneliness, that Gen Z on the whole is kind of lonely overall. And this, so heavy social media users and those who never use social media had similar scores. Now this generally makes sense, right? In a lot of ways, because, and we'll see kind of, I think some social media numbers a little bit later in the course, but social media is a pretty universal thing amongst Gen Z, right? Social media on the whole is used by a bulk of the generation. So the effects are going to be distributed widely whether you use social media or not, because if you're not using it, your peers are using it, and so whatever's affecting your peers is going to affect you in major ways as well. Okay. Springtide also cited a report put out by the Ford Motor Company, that makes cars. And this is one of those interesting things. Corporations also do a lot of polling because corporations, and here's where, Ford's survey is kind of interesting. They're trying to get ahead of trends, right? They're trying to figure out where their consumers are going to be, where they are today, where they're going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 years in the future, so that they know how to market to them, so they know what kind of products they're going to be buying, so they know what their values are. Theoretically, if your generation values large families, right, you should probably be building some big SUVs with lots of seats. If they value, or if they're worried about climate change, you probably want to build electric cars, right? So corporations are always doing this kind of research on people. And Ford has, and I will say, this is my favorite thing ever. The person who put out the report is Ford's, and this is his title, and I want this. I would quit any job to take this job. So Ford has a chief futurologist. And I don't know why, but I would literally quit any job I have if someone offered me the position, well, with good pay, of course, of chief futurologist somewhere, because the title just sounds so cool. I can imagine, at parties being like, oh, so what do you do? I'm the chief futurologist at Ford Motor Company. Well, what do you do? I look at polls all day. Okay, now, what did Ford find, though? And then that's more important than the fact that they have a chief futurologist. Okay, so let's highlighter. So Ford as well found that loneliness was one of the most pressing issues confronting society. And specifically, that you have a whole bunch of things going on. So trust in institutions and brands was declining, and many people feel they lack trusting relationships with peers as well. So basically, on an institutional and a personal level, people didn't trust other people or corporations or brands. And so, they were, and I mean, maybe rightly so, but this meant there's not a lot of trust in society. And yeah, without that bedrock of trust in society, people start to feel increasingly anxious. And if you kind of remember towards the beginning of the course, right, when we were talking about the different generational cohorts and especially Gen Z, right, we had those charts that showed, growing economic inequality and the kind of, we talked about the corrosive effect that growing inequality has on people's trust in institutions. Okay, so Springtide's own data, right? So Springtide went and did their own data, specifically looking at Gen Z. And they surveyed, and this is one of their smaller surveys, because they were still getting started. So this is data out of 2019. So again, we're predating COVID. So I guess this report came out in, is this 2020? I think this came out in 2021, but this was based on their 2019 data. So they had 1,000 surveys, which is a decent representative sample, and 35 qualitative interviews. So somewhat small sample size, but still some interesting findings that come out of it if you take them, with a grain of salt. Okay, and one of the parts of the survey, it's a relatively big survey, but part of what they ask is about loneliness using the scoring system from UCLA's Loneliness Index. Okay, so what did they find with Gen Z? High rates of loneliness, social isolation, and stress. Okay, so this I think is important, and we'll talk about all of those and what they look like. One of the things, so in this should be qualitative. I wrote that wrong. In the qualitative portion of the study, one of the things that Gen Z said, right? So when they were being interviewed, right? They had done the survey, and then 35 of them were then interviewed in these in-depth 2-hour-long interviews. So one of the, questions that was asked by the researchers was asking the young people where they felt they belonged, right? And specifically, like what institutions, like do you feel like you belong at school? Do you feel like you belong, at church or whatever it happens to be? And what the researchers kind of said in the report was that in a lot of cases, Gen Z sort of struggled with the question a little bit. Because for Gen Z, according to this report, belonging wasn't something that happened in institutions, right? So it's not a quality of institutions, but it's rather you belong with people, right? And if you kind of remember this, right, I know we went through it really quickly when we talked about religion because we were almost at the end of the class and I wanted to include it on the exam. But if you remember, right, one of the things that Gen Z said with regards to religion, that they were looking for connection, right? And they were willing to enter institutions where they thought connections were possible and stay in institutions where connections exist. But a big part of their sort of religious journey was about connection, right? Connection with other people. And they were searching out those personal relationships in really deep ways, right? So they weren't like, I'm Catholic, so I just stay in the Catholic church, right? Or I'm Muslim, I just stay, in the local mosque. It was more like, where can I make meaningful connections? That was a much more Gen Z kind of way of thinking. And so, yeah, I mean, people make them feel like they belong, right? This was their kind of takeaway. People feel like they make them belong, not institutions. So when it's like, where do you belong was less relevant to Gen Z than whom do you belong with? Okay. Hey, Prof, when is the final again? That's interesting. When is the final? I think the 14th. Okay, the 14th. And again, good question. The 14th, and it's one of those things, again, it's open the whole day, right? So I'll come in at a particular time and I'll let you know when I'll be around on campus. But again, you have the whole day. How did Ford come to the conclusion that loneliness plays a role in brands declining and not just better vehicles from other manufacturers? Okay, this is an interesting question. I think what they're more getting at than maybe the way you're phrasing it was that people trusted brands less across the board, right? So if you ask them to rate, like, how much do you trust Ford or Toyota or Walmart or Target, just generally speaking, and compared to past market research, people show less trust in brands, right? Now, how does that relate to loneliness? Well, brands, in a sense, are part of identities, right? They're part of, how people construct meaningful things. The whole city of Edmonton right now is undergoing a giant branding where, are you an Oilers fan and do you wear the Oilers merchandise? Are you part of that community? But generally, I mean, trust me, if you've been around the city long enough, you know that trust in that particular brand has ebbed and flowed as things have gone well and less well. I can remember times where, people were baying outside of the Oilers head office for blood. And right now, I think they could do no wrong. But, loneliness is disconnection from institutions and identities, right? It plays a big part in it. So it might not be, this one-to-one, like people are more lonely because they don't trust Ford, but as, their decline, their trust in institutions generally, brands, and companies, corporations, government institutions, declines, they're going to feel, in a lot of ways, less and less connected to things, and there's going to be less and less places that they feel like they belong. I mean, brands, in some ways, and I don't know if this is as much the case anymore, used to be major points of connection for people, right? I mean, if you go back to, my mother-in-law is still like this. She, her dad was not a Ford guy. He was vehemently opposed to Fords, hated them, and to this day, like, my wife owns a Ford Fusion, a car, and when we bought it, she was like, a Ford? Why would you buy a Ford? And I was like, I don't know, it's a good car. It's fine. Consumer Reports said it's okay. So brands have been a way that people kind of identify with each other, right? And there's been communities around brands. Think of Harley Davidson, right? Harley Davidson has a huge brand culture, but less and less as people stop identifying with it as much. But it's a really good question. Okay. So, loneliness. So what Springtide found, they said 1 in 3. Oops, I don't want my highlighter. I want my pen. 1 in 3. And again, that's really important. 1 in 3. Young people reported feeling alone much of the time, right? So they felt lonely. And this is like, I feel completely alone. This is this little number right here. And sorry, my graphics are terrible because they didn't have a PDF version that I could take nice screenshots off of, so I had to take pictures of the actual physical book. So it doesn't look the best. So 1 in 3 young people reported that they felt alone much of the time. And again, because Springtide's interested in religion, and that's sort of where they got their start, was talking to religious congregations, right? They basically, have kind of looked at the sample to see if there was a big difference between those who attend religious gatherings and those who don't, just because like a big part of their market for people who buy these kinds of books are, church staff, people who are interested in the religious lives of their young people. Okay, so what they found, right, not really significant differences between the two. People, almost 40% of young people overall felt like they had no one to talk to. A third felt completely lonely. And yeah, so this is some people responded either sometimes or always. 45% felt no one understood them. Again, a third said that they felt no one really knew them very well. And 2/5, right, 40% or a little bit above, said that it was difficult for them to make friends. So these are all concerning numbers. Okay. So this is just the kind of breakdown, right, in terms of, what makes up that kind of total number. So 8%, so almost 1 in 10 young people said that they had no one to talk to always, right? So that would be concerning, right? Like every 10th person in any given high school, would say that they had no one to talk to always, right? And, 31%, so a much larger, almost a third, said sometimes, right? They felt like they had no one to talk to sometimes. 12% of them said they felt left out always, 27 sometimes, for a total of 39%. Again, almost a third said they felt that their relationships were superficial. 7%, so a little bit less than the having no one to talk to, said some always, and then 24% or a quarter said sometimes. I find this one's a really interesting one, actually, and perhaps because of some of my kind of general interests in the topic and some other things that I've read, right? That people are around me but not with me. 1 in 10 said they always felt that way, and almost, not quite 1 in 3, but almost 1 in 3, almost 30% said sometimes. Now this I think is really interesting because it kind of tracks into a book that was written in about 2012, right, by a lady named Sherry Turkle, called Alone Together. And this was specifically about social media. And this was kind of, in the midst of the big transformation brought about by smartphones and how much smartphones kind of change things. And I'll put her name, Turkle, right? Really interesting book. And if you're looking for some light summer reading, 100% you should read Sherry Turkle's Alone Together. It's really, really quite interesting. Pick up, your fun copy of Bowling Alone and Alone Together, and you can make it a Depression Sunday for your beach reading. But what I think is kind of interesting about this, right, is one of the points that Turkle makes in Alone Together is that increasingly, driven by social media on phones and text messaging, young people found themselves, and I guess it kind of, related to these two things. And here, she wrote another book where I think this kind of comes out, which I used to teach on and I've kind of pulled out of the course. It's called Reclaiming Conversation. I'll just put Reclaiming Convo, about these two things and the way that she thinks a lot of this is driven by smartphones and social media, right? So people are with you, around you, but not with you, right? Because in any given circumstance, people might be with you, but they're on their phones, right? They are distracted by technology, so you feel like they're there, but they're not there at the same time. Like they're present, but digitally, their digital self is somewhere else. And especially for young people, a lot of them complained, in Turkle's research, that they felt like this meant it was hard to get into really deep conversations with people because the second things started to get interesting, a notification would pop up. A notification would pop up and interrupt the conversation, or they would get uncomfortable and retreat into their phone. So these are both kind of problems that other researchers have also kind of cited, and that's Turkle as well. Okay, and then feeling isolated from others. Again, 1 in 10 young people feel isolated from others always, and a quarter of them feel that they're isolated from others sometimes. All of these, mean that, somewhere in the range of a third of young people are struggling in relationships and feeling isolated in major ways. Okay, so meaningful interactions a day. All right, so one of the things that they asked, in this particular survey is how many meaningful interactions people felt like they had in a day. And what you can see again is, in the darkest number, 9%, or again, almost 1 in 10 young people said they felt that they had 0 meaningful interactions with people in a particular day, right? When you added 1 to 3, right, it was 2/3 of young people said they had, basically 3 or fewer meaningful interactions per day, right? So not a lot of meaningful interactions. And then, minorities, 5 or more, 14%, 4 to 5, basically, or more than 5, I guess. 4 to 5 was about a fifth of the sample. Okay, so that's a lot of young people that are having relatively few meaningful interactions in a day. 40%, feel like no one knows them. And, again, going back to that kind of concept a few slides ago, right? Belonging, right, was people. Belonging is people. Abbreviate it. People. And, basically feeling like you belong is feeling like people know you really, really well, right? And you can see some kind of, some interesting connections with other things we've talked about in the course, right? So when we think about like what Donna Freitas was talking about with people's idea of romance, what did people really want out of a romantic partner, right? They wanted to feel known, right? They wanted to spend time, on long walks. They wanted to have coffee and picnics and sit under the stars and talk for endless hours, right? Or sit in your room with 100 lit candles and burn your house down. But get to know the person really well in those 3 hours before you light your house on fire. Right? So it was about being really deeply known. So that seems to be what Gen Z really wants out of relationships, but in some ways is deeply struggling with as well, right? Deeply struggling, and lots of them, don't feel like anyone knows them, right? 40% feel, always or sometimes like no one knows them. So that's a lot of young people that are going to feel very disconnected and very lonely, when you want to belong with people, but you don't feel like that many people know you. Okay. So, just some kind of basic things that came out in terms of stress, loneliness, and anxiety. All of these things sort of started to grow with millennials, right? We saw towards the kind of end of the millennial generation that these were becoming really serious problems. And that has just continued with Gen Z, right? So, half of young people, every other person in the survey experienced multiple stress factors. This one I think is interesting, and I'll look at what's on the infographic here in a sec. A lot of the participants in the survey said that their stress and anxiety got in the way of them building connections and belonging. I'm going to highlight that. Why? Because I feel like it. Stress and anxiety got in the way of building connections and belongingness. Okay. And again, that's kind of important, right? Because they want to feel known by people, but their stress and their anxiety maybe stops them from venturing into social situations where they feel like they could get to know people, right? But they're anxious about it. They're stressed. Maybe it's time crunches, multiple kind of things going on. Like this one, right? So if we look at this, and these are our stress factors, right? 2/3 of our young people in the sample said they don't feel like they have enough time to get stuff done. Okay, so that would be a stressor. It's like, I want to go to this party and get to know people, or I want to join, the local anime club. Don't knock it till you try it. I met lots of cool people at anime clubs, actually, when I was an undergrad. But, it's like, I have too much to do, so I'm not going to venture out of those things. And then like social anxiety, stress made them feel like they couldn't connect, which again, because their connection is found in people in relationships, not institutions. They want to build those deep connections. They feel lonely when they don't have them. It's a sort of a vicious cycle. Okay, and then 35% of young people, so again, 1 in 3, a little bit more than 1 in 3, reported having no one to turn to when they were stressed. Okay, just a couple quick things, right? So 58%. So again, we're talking, more than half, right? More than half. Almost 3/5. Spam call. Almost 3/5. I said no on my watch. Okay, there we go. Thank you for that, phone. This is what happens when you connect all of your devices together. They want to talk to each other, and you say, oh, on my watch, I'm not taking this call. And then it pops up on your screen, and then, okay. At least it wasn't bad, right? Okay. So, what was I saying? Right. So just over 1/3 of young people say they have no one to turn to. This one is, I think, interesting. Don't have enough time to get done. They feel stressed overall. So 3/5 of our young people basically said, so like 3 out of every 5, They felt fatigued, tired, even when they wake up after adequate sleep. Okay, and Twenge talks about this in her book iGen. And we'll talk about this as well when we talk the anxious generation, because this matters quite a bit. But the average number of hours of sleep that a teenager gets today, or a young person gets today, has been declining basically for, I guess now, it's a little bit over a decade, right? Sort of starts around 2010, 2012. And since then, we've seen declining hours of sleep. And on average, right, if we took best practices from psychology, from medicine, young people, right, kind of in those developmental years between 13 and 22, 23, should be getting, optimally about 9 hours of sleep per night. I know, that sounds insane. Did someone giggle? Okay. 6, right? Maybe 5. Again, this is for optimal mental functioning, right? Now, one of the things, even after adequate sleep, stress can obviously disrupt sleep and kind of sleep depth. That's a major thing. The other one that Twenge and Haidt both talk about is phones. And this is especially true for teenagers, doubly true for teenage girls. Phones by bedsides, right? Are one of what we think are the chief culprits in the decline of sleep amongst teenagers. Why? Well, because they're incredibly distracting. All right, there's a million things to do on your phone. It's much more entertaining than trying to sleep. I got 2 kids. My oldest is 4. I got 3 kids. Sorry, I had 2 that are kind of teenager age, and one that's 4. He's very cheerful and wakes up super early, which is not my favorite. But the other 2, right, tend to not want to go to bed. And until both of them dunked their cell phones in the toilet, which was, I will say, in equal measures, both the happiest days of my life, and destroyed them, and now are not getting new phones for a while. Both of them, we kind of struggled to keep their phones out of their bedrooms. And it was one of these things, right, you'd go and check on them, and it's like, under the cover, someone's playing Geometry Dash. And it's like, oh, okay. So phones are very distracting. Teen girls especially, right? Notifications off of social media, ping ping, people are texting you, people are sending you messages way too late. I mean, my daughter has this. She has this one boy, I think he has a crush on her, and he'll text her at 9:45 at night or 10 o'clock at night. I take possession of her phone at 8:30 when I'm on it, and it's like, hey, I feel lonely. It's like, Noah, go away. Katin needs to go to sleep now. You need to stop with this. Anyway, and yeah, I'll, sometimes if you just kind of turn it on and check it in the morning because it sits in the kitchen, right? She's got 15 text messages from when she went to bed, just never as early as I want, and, the morning, which I think is completely insane. Nobody likes me this much to text me in the middle of the night. It's one of those things. If I get a text at 11 o'clock, I'm like, who died? That's what happens when you're in your 40s, I guess. It's like, are my parents okay? All right. So sleep declining, linked to phones especially, and all of the distractions, screens, right? And especially, again, for girls, social media and all of the notifications on social media, and a sort of, FOMO, fear of missing out, that if I'm not actively engaged in it, I'm missing something that is going on. Okay, so that's on the sleep figure, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then 56% of them say they have, so again, over half say they have a hard time feeling relaxed. And all of these numbers, if we look at it historically, are trending in sort of what we would think of as the wrong direction. Teenagers and young adults used to display much less stress than older people, especially middle-aged people. And now it's actually kind of flattened out. And I was actually just reading about this on Jonathan Haidt's Substack a couple of days ago. See, this is how contemporary what you're getting is. They're fresh takes. What we used to have was called a U-shaped curve of happiness, right? So basically, at like 18, people were pretty happy. Around 40, and as they got into adulthood, you got a mortgage, you had kids, your life got harder, your happiness dipped. And then, once your kids kind of got older, you had less responsibilities, your mortgage was paid off, you got happier again. So like 65-year-olds and 18-year-olds were like the happiest people in the world. And, it was middle-aged people who were like the least happy people in a society. And it's called the U-shaped curve, right? Because it was high at both ends and low in the middle. That looks like I said 4G, but that should be 40. Today, right, the curve is basically, well, like there's no curve, right? It basically is like this, flat up, right? So basically, young adults are miserable, middle-aged people are miserable, and then once you retire, people get a lot happier. But it's basically now a kind of flat curve. So, all of these factors, well, they used to be, young adults were pretty happy, adventurous. Now they're feeling more stressed out, more depressed, and all of these things, and feeling less happy in general. So things are trending in kind of weird directions. Okay, so do I have Ryan's slide? Oh. A percentage of people that can function 100% on less than 7 hours of sleep, round to the nearest whole number, is 0%. That's probably true. All right. I had I think I maybe don't have them in this one. I had them last term, but I might have put them in a different presentation. When we talk about institutional collapse, right, is this really kind of interesting phenomenon going on. One of the things that we know is, generally speaking, trust in institutions has been declining for a fairly long time, right? People trust institutions far less than they did in the past. These are just studies, numbers from Springtide. And what you can see here, right, is that basically on a scale of 1 to 10, from complete trust to no trust at all, this is where people rated different kind of social institutions. And you can see that basically like 3 of them, banks, public schools, and nonprofit organizations, all ranked around 50%, right? So people, kind of trust them like halfway. Everything else, right? So organized religion, the media, the presidency and Congress, or you could say politics and big business, were all well below, 50%. So trust in institutions is relatively low, and you can kind of see, it's been declining. I guess people don't trust big business that much, right? They didn't trust it that much in the 70s. The medical system, though, this one kind of interests me. Again, this is prior to COVID. This is kind of interesting. In the 1970s, 80% of Americans would have trusted the medical system. Today, it's 36%. The presidency, can't say I blame them there, right? But declining. TV news, people didn't trust it that much, but they trusted even less. Congress, well-deserved 11%. If we want to say Parliament, we could say that too. I don't know if it's quite that low, but it should be. And then again, you can see the declining trends all the way across here. People trust institutions about half as much as they did in the past for the most part. So this is a sort of institutional collapse, right? And you're not going to get involved if you don't trust an institution, right? You're not going to get involved in institutions you don't fundamentally trust. And I mean, this is across the board. And you could look at this in all sorts of spheres, right? Declines in organized religion probably have something to do with the fact that there's been a general decline in trust in organized religions. And it makes sense. Like a lot of this really steep decline, especially say for the Roman Catholic Church, starting around the early 2000s. The early 2000s were the years where the sex abuse scandal started to be revealed, right? The priestly sex abuse scandal where they abused children started to be revealed first in Boston and then kind of around the world. So trust in organized religion was relatively high before then, declined significantly after that. And this is true, like the presidency, right, in politics, trust was relatively high at some points in the past. The Nixon administration seems to have been a particularly, punctiliar moment or decline in politics. But like all sorts of things, the Boy Scouts, which, face their own kind of sex abuse scandals, decline in the Boy Scouts. And all these sorts of organizations people have trusted less and less. And again, you're not going to get involved in institutions you don't trust. Okay, so this is, I think, interesting. So, trusted adults, right? And now remember, I don't know if you remember this term, and you should, because we didn't talk about it that long ago. Right? This is one of the 9 factors that Smith and Denton talked about as to why they thought religious youth were doing better than others, right? Network closure, which was how many trusted adults do you have in your life that you feel like you can talk to and your parents felt like they could talk to you, right? All this created a sort of network around young people that seemed to improve, generally speaking, a lot of their life outcomes. Now, again, it was only one of the 9 factors. I tend to think of it as the most important one. It's number 1. It's number 1. Number 1. Okay, but if people just see what's written on the slides, it'll make no sense. That's okay. Very important. So what do we see with this study of Gen Z? Okay, so these are all these markers, right? So this is feel completely alone in red, in green, no one understands me, I feel left out. So for those young people that had 0 trusted adults, right, these numbers are extremely high, right? 62% of them say they feel completely alone. 70% said they feel no one understands them. Again, 60%, so 3/5. So if you meet 5 people that have 0 close adults or trusted adults, 3 out of 5 of them are going to say that they feel left out, and 75%, or roughly 3/4, right, say they feel stressed and overwhelmed. Okay, so obviously what we see here, is that 1 trusted adult will lower those numbers significantly, right? 1 trusted adult and feeling completely alone goes from 62% to 46%, right? So 2 to 4 decreases feelings of not being understood by 22%. A relationship with 1 decreases it by 16%. And you see, right, the general markers of stress, loneliness, and isolation decline significantly the more trusted adults are in a young person's life. Okay, so trusted adults, right? Let me see. 8%, roughly 8%, or 1 in 10. Do I have this on the next slide? No, I just have a different graph trying to say that. But yeah, roughly, 8% of young people said they had no trusted adults, right? So almost 1 in 10. 23%, or almost a quarter, said they had only 1. So you guess probably 1 parent. Half, which is a good number, have 2 to 4, and only 17%, have 5 or more. Okay. So, I guess what does this all kind of tell us? I think one of the problems here, and one of the things that's really complicated, we kind of see it when we talk about religion a little bit, I think, is that, and again, remember when I talked about those 9 cultural factors, right? And I talked about cultural capital and social capital. One of the things that I kind of noted, and that Smith and Denton noted, was that religious institutions are one of these weird kind of institutions of life where young people will tend to interact with an age-mixed kind of group of adults, right? Whereas opposed to, like a classroom or a school where, the vast majority of people in the school are children, right? They're students, adolescents. There's one teacher to 25 to sometimes 40 students or more maybe, versus, right, a religious congregation or other kind of community organizations where that ratio is likely to be a lot more balanced, right? Where you're going to have more adults for each kid, right? For each young person. So those kinds of institutional settings make it really, really much easier for young people to connect with trusted adults, right? There are more trusted adults there, potentially, and it's a much more age stratified or age non-stratified kind of environment. So that's what institutions do. Now, why does this potentially present a problem for Gen Z? Again, I'll just kind of highlight how big this difference is, right? 0 trusted adults. I feel completely alone. 62 versus 5, it's 9, right? I feel as if no one understands me. 0 trusted adults, 70% versus a quarter. That's still higher than you'd like it to be. I feel left out, right? 60% versus 21. I feel stressed or overwhelmed, 73% versus 39. So, what does this all kind of boil down to? Let me just check where my next slide is. Okay. Okay, perfect. Now we're into a different topic. Okay, all right, so how to put this? There used to be this whole kind of category of institutions in society that we call mediating institutions, right? This is going to be me at my most preachy. So these are basically, sort of institutions that sit somewhere between the state and family, right? Mediating institutions are kind of somewhere between you as an individual or your family. Maybe we should say individual. Let's say individual, because that'll be a little bit clearer. I know, I love my writing. You and the state, right? And in here, you used to have a bunch of mediating institutions. And these would have been things like, religious congregations, political parties, clubs, community leagues, right? I'll just put CLs for community leagues. Things like the Lions Club, the Lions Club, Kiwanis, societies, clubs, the Women's Society of Edmonton, all of these sorts of things that were these kinds of collective organizations where people got together. Now, what's happened roughly from about the 1980s to today is that much of this has been hollowed out, right? A lot of these societies and essentially, I think what's happened, like I said, Putnam, in his book Bowling Alone, blamed this on cable television, right? The world got so much more entertaining with the advent of cable television that people didn't have to wander out into the world to find entertainment. They could just sit in their house and be entertained. Putnam hadn't even begun to wrestle with, the online world, Netflix, social media, multiplayer video games, or any of that kind of stuff, right? Reddit or any of that. But what happened is, as those technologies came in, people stayed home more, they became more individualistic and far less collectivist, and they stopped participating in institutions. And a lot of these institutions have been kind of left to wither and die on the vine. There's nobody replacing them. And a really interesting example of this, right, there was the Edmonton's Women's Society, and it was a society that had been in Edmonton since the end of the 19th century, and it had been involved in things like, the struggle for women's suffrage and the feminist movement and, all sorts of equality movements. And a couple of years ago, the remaining 10 75-year-old and older members basically said, well, nobody seems to be interested in joining the Edmonton Women's Society, so we're just going to close up shop. And they took the remaining, I think it was $500,000 in funds that they had sitting in their bank accounts and just gave it away to charity, right? And they closed the Women's Society because there was no one to come in and kind of, take over that institution and keep it going. Everybody had sort of stayed home, right? Again, this is kind of the thesis of Putnam's Bowling Alone, is that a lot of those middle institutions, right? The things that used to sit right here where you would meet people, you would gather, you would join a cause, have been hollowed out in favor of other things. And that means, you get more risk of being there, right? That you're more likely, or even, shall we say, oopsie, I killed it again. I turned on the main audio. I don't know how that happens. Without those mediating institutions, basically people are these increasingly at risk of being these sort of floating autonomous agents, and experiencing, hey, you want to throw some straight up Durkheim, some classical sociology at you? The big risk, we'll take a term from Durkheim, anomie, right? Now, Durkheim was worried about this when we talked about urbanization, right? You would move out of the medieval village where you knew everybody into a big industrial city where you didn't know your neighbors, and you would experience anomie. And in a lot of ways, that didn't happen, right? Because most people moved, and they moved into ethnic enclaves. They moved, if you were Italian, you moved, and you had a Catholic church at the center of your community. But anomie seems to have, in my opinion, again, I'm just one guy, seems to have really struck with the coming of online and more entertainment in the home, which has hollowed out the institutions, between you and the state that basically kept you from feeling a lot of this anomie, right? And anomie is a sense of social disconnection, social isolation, loss of values and norms, according to Durkheim. Okay, so what would I say? I won't give advice very often. I'll write it so you know what I mean. So there's no ambiguity. Join some kind of, if you feel lonely or if you're worried about isolation and loneliness, join some kind of mediating institution. A social, Edmonton Sport and Social Club, or some kind of team, or a club, or a religious congregation, right? And whether you believe in it or not, right? The actual, and this is going very much against kind of Western orientation, which I will only join something that I believe in. That might not be the best way to go, because if people stay away from these institutions, they wither and die, which means people are more likely to be socially isolated. And it leaves less spaces, especially for young people, to go to get this, right? 5 or more trusted adults, right? Because that's where you're going to meet them, is in institutions. Let's say trusted adults are not just going to come over to your house for the most part, and that's probably a good thing, because that would be creepy. So it's like, hi, I'm a trusting adult. Could I come to your house?
Has anything else similar to mediating institutions, or something else to replace the void? I think one of the things I think is online communities, has any of that kind of worked to fill that void that these institutions have?
All right, so this is an interesting question. I like where your head's at. It's a very Gen Z way of thinking. I appreciate it. Okay, so here, I'll talk about Turkle again, because I think Turkle is kind of instructive in this. So what Turkle will say is there's essentially 2 kinds of ties, right? Social ties. There are social ties that are weak ties, and there are social ties that are strong ties. And what I think we can say is that, yes, people have moved into, say, online communities in lots of ways, right? Oh my gosh, we're going to talk about some of them when we talk about Haidt's book, because some of them, I didn't know about them until I read his book, and they're horrifying. Sorry, I can't remember. There's one, it's specifically a Japanese term that people have adopted widely for basically male shut-ins who NEET is one, because not engaged in employment, education, or training. That's one of them. It's a Japanese term. It's I can't remember. It starts with an H, but it's basically I'm going to be a shut-in and spend all my time on. Yes, hikikomori. That's the one. I'm a little scared that you know that. That's a little. Yes, let's do that. Okay. Anyway. But yes, some of these online communities. So they tend to generate what Turkle will call weak ties, right? Which is that people are, relatively weakly attached, right? And if you want to understand what a weak tie looks like in an online community, think of that kid you went to junior high with, who added you on Facebook or Instagram, right? Because they basically know your name. And so it boosts up your friend count on Facebook. They still have friends on, I haven't logged onto Facebook in 3 years. They still have friends on Facebook, right? Okay, I actually just took it off my phone because I was like, I don't use this anymore. It's complete. What's that? No, it's not like, honestly, what does this app even do anymore? This was my experience with Snapchat too. I had it on my phone for like 8 minutes and I'm like, I don't understand what this is. No one I know uses it. Goodbye. So Snapchat now has all the data about me that says this person is too old to use Snapchat. But yeah, I mean, so that is a weak tie, right? It's a social connection, but one that's relatively weak, right? And if if something happens to you, right? Let's say that let's say on the disaster side, you get cancer, right? And you have to undergo chemotherapy. You can't work, right? You're really struggling. What is that weak tie on Facebook likely to say? And I quote, sending hugs, right? That's how I feel about this, right? Now, so that's a weak tie, right? You're weakly connected to these people, right? They might send moral support in general, but it's unlikely to generate real kind of sustained engagement for the most part. Strong ties, on the other hand, tend to be grounded in long-term trusting relationships. And when Turkle talks about it, she talks about, Turkle, yes. I was like, Turkle Twangy? No, it's Turkle. When she talks about it, she's like, if we look at, say, the civil rights movement, right? Those were people that had really strong ties to each other, right? Martin Luther King Jr. and all of the people around him really trusted each other. And so they could organize for collective action. But you can think about this even on a kind of a much weaker level, right? So, think about it this way. I know lots of people who are part of, say, religious communities, right? Like very Orthodox Jews, very, practicing evangelicals and Catholics. And one of the things that I've kind of observed is when one of them has a baby, right? A sort of tsunami of food arrives at the door, right? Honestly, for my friends who are Orthodox Jews, they had a baby, and I swear it must have been the entire synagogue, the entire community brought food. I think they probably had food for a month, right? Just sitting in the freezer all of a sudden. And this is strong ties, right? Again, I always use religious examples because I'm a religion nerd at my heart of hearts. It doesn't have to be religion. You can get strong ties in lots of different places, and those mediating institutions create it. But I think, yes, you've had, this is the longest, most rambling answer to a question. But I think what, those online communities, r/whatever on Reddit, or, the My Little Pony, the Brony fan community, that used to, they used to gather, especially in the forums, at what was it? It was the fake newspaper, the Equestria Daily or something. I don't even remember. I saw it in a documentary about bronies, and I think they're amazingly fun. But yeah, it was this website that served as the central hub of brony activity. But these are relatively weak ties, right? If something happens to you, A, they tend to be very dispersed, and B, they tend to be oh yeah, you have my moral support, rather than okay, you're sick or you just had a baby and you're going to struggle for a little bit. Here's tangible, support, or these types of things. So I would say it has been replaced, but the qualities of the two things aren't exactly the same, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm really sorry. That was a much less coherent answer than I would like to offer. Okay. How am I doing for time? Oh, so awesomely terrible. Okay. No, it's good. All right. So I'm going to move into a slightly different flavor. So away from Springtide, which I think that loneliness stuff is really, really interesting. And, I stand on it very strongly because I really do think, the loss of mediating institutions is a sort of social catastrophe, a slow rolling one, but a social catastrophe nonetheless. Okay, and now I just want to go to, some other kind of mental health kind of indicators to just kind of talk about. Okay, so we'll look at a bunch of stuff, a bunch of charts. You're going to feel very much beaten up by charts. I'm sorry, but it's the best way. So, 2021 study of adolescent mental health in the Journal of Adolescence from Twenge, Jean Twenge, right, the Generations lady. found that adolescent mental health was declining worldwide. And I'm going to, because I'm a dork, and I'm going to highlight this. I'm going to highlight it in purple for no reason. Declining worldwide is really important. So this is not, say, a localized phenomenon. This isn't Trump, though Trump is depressing enough. Generally speaking, right, this is a worldwide phenomenon, and we see it certainly across the Anglosphere, right, English-speaking countries, but we also see it in other places like the Nordic countries in major ways. Okay, so very importantly again, it began prior to COVID, right? This slide has been going for a while, but the COVID lockdowns seem to have made it worse, affecting both males and females. And I think, you know, some of these things, especially internalizing mental disorders, right, as opposed to externalizing ones. So things like depression, anxiety, are internalizing, you know, aggression, you know, and violence are externalizing. But internalizing mental disorders are growing, particularly amongst females, right? It's more pronounced amongst females, but it's present in both as well. Okay, now, maybe related to general declines in time spent with other people, and, you know, as of what I've been talking about just in the last bit, deinstitutionalization and the loss of those mediating institutions and social media likely play a role in this. Right? And especially we're going to see it most in Gen Z. Why? As we saw kind of at the beginning of the course from Twenke, they spend the least time out in the real world than any other generation, right? There's a reason that the you know, expression, you know, go touch grass is one that is sort of, you know, unique to Gen Z, is because they don't, right? You wouldn't have an expression telling people to go touch grass if it was something they did as part of their normal course of life. Okay, so a bunch of data here. I'm going to beat you up with some data. So, Youth Risk Behavior Survey from the Center for Disease Control in the US. What are we seeing here? And again, we got a good solid 10 years of data. So, experiencing persistent feelings of sadness or depression. In 2011, it was 28%. In 2021, it was 42%. The red sign, by the way, the stop sign, that means it's bad. It's a bad trend. So 28% of young people in 2011, and you see it kind of stayed steady, right? This is a 1% or 2%, 3% increase. 2019 takes a big jump, and that's the biggest jump. So again, prior to COVID, and then again, a pretty reasonable jump, you know, in 2021, just after COVID. Okay. Experience poor mental health. This doesn't tell us much, but, you know, almost 30% said they did. Now this is, you know, this is a new question. So when you see all these little lines, that means this is a new question that they just started to ask in 2021, which tells us that the CDC started to worry about young people experiencing poor mental health in their 2021 survey, right? They saw something in their other data that said we should start asking questions about this. Seriously considered attempting suicide, right? 16%. Not a huge jump, right? We're talking a 6% jump, you know, kind of steady, little jump, somewhat larger jump. Still a bad trend, you know, where, you know, a little bit over a fifth have considered committing suicide. And again, the made a suicide plan, which is usually the step where, you know, you're like, okay, things have gotten serious, has gone up as well. You know, attempted suicide, the number is pretty steady. A 2% difference is, you know, I think within margin of error. But still, you know, the trend looks like it's going in the wrong way. And were injured in a suicide attempt that had to be treated by a doctor or nurse. It's basically flat, yellow triangle, or no, square on its side says that. Okay, so again, so this is from the CDC report. Percentage of males and female who report persistent sadness or hopelessness. And you see in 2011 for females, it was 36%, bad for both, right? 36%, and it's now almost 60%, right? So, I mean, it hasn't quite doubled, but it's heading in that direction. And for males, it's grown by, 8%, not as quickly as for females, but is definitely trending in the wrong direction. So this is a concerning trend. Again, this is CDC numbers. Males and female students who seriously consider attempting suicide, for females, it was 19% in 2011. It grew 11%. And for males, it only grew 1%, right? So it hasn't grown a whole lot, but still trending in the wrong direction. Okay. Here's the kicker, right? This is the one you want to pay attention to. So this comes out of the American Time Use Study, right? American Time Use Study, which is this long-running thing that's been going since I think the 1980s. Basically looking at how people use their time by generational cohort, right? Or I guess it's all it surveys a bunch of people and then they split it up by generational cohort. This is a graph by 150 minutes a day. It's just a little bit, north of 2 hours, right? 2 hours, 2.5 hours, roughly, each day with friends. And that's always been, right? This youngest part of the cohort, right? The one with the least responsibilities, the most likely to be in school, the least likely to be, engaged in work or married or having children, all that stuff, right, is going to have the most kind of time. And what we see is a general pattern since the early 2000s of decline. It went down, to under 2 hours, right around 2008, recovered a bit, by 2010. And then once it hits 2012, and why is there a big gray line there? Well, 2012, if you recall, is the year where half of Americans own a smartphone, right? 2012 is the year where half of Americans own a smartphone, and you're talking about 75%. Oops, my pen has gone goofy. I bent the tip some more. Well, what will I do? It's fixed. Okay. That's what I get for buying a $20 pen off Amazon. Right. So, here that's where, 50% of Americans own a smartphone, 75% of teenagers, 94% of emerging adults, right, own a smartphone. So, what happens after that? Well, the time spent with friends takes a hard nosedive, 2018, and then, you get to about 2020, which is about here. It takes a hard nosedive, but it's been heading down for a long time. Now, this is true of all age cohorts, right? All age cohorts have seen a decline. However, the decline is just the most marked in that youngest part of, the American population. So it's a big, big decline in time spent with friends. Okay, so serious markers of mental illness are also increasing amongst young Americans. So what do we have? Anxiety. Oh, is my pen not working? My backup pen's not working. Oh well, okay. Maybe the battery's dead. Or maybe the fact that I dropped it and had to glue it back together is the thing that killed it. Okay, no dice. All right, so when we look at anxiety and mental illness in general, right? So what do we see? Well, we see, in terms of our age cohorts, hey man, 50 plus, they're doing great, right? They're doing fine. Their anxiety has not increased in a long time. It's pretty much flat. For our 35 to, since 2010, for our 35 to 49-year-olds, right, it's up a little bit, but it's a pretty small increase from here. It's about 6%. It's about 6 or 7%. A little bit younger, right? So more in the kind of older part of our emerging adults and just beyond that, we've got an increase from, just about 5% to 9% for that cohort. But obviously, the blue line, our youngest cohort, 18 to 25, started a little higher than everyone else in 2010 or 2008, right? Basically about 7%. And then you hit 2012 again, right? That's our iPhone year. And it absolutely skyrockets, by a solid 7, 8%. Okay. And then US undergraduates diagnosed with a mental illness, right? Anxiety has shot up, depression has shot up again pretty markedly since 2012. ADHD, less so, although still an increase, and I think that makes sense. Doesn't, technology make us all a little bit ADHD? Try reading a book with your phone next to you. It's hard because your phone's going to go ping, 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 ping. Pay attention to me. Why are you reading Shakespeare? That's bad. There's more Shakespeare here. Would you like me to look up information about Shakespeare? I could do that. God, it's going to get worse with AI. And then all these other things, bipolar, anorexia, substance abuse, are more or less flat, slight increases, but I wouldn't say statistically significant. It's these two, right, that have really jumped. Okay, tiny charts. I made my charts tiny. I'm really sorry. I wanted to get a lot in on this. Okay, so suicide, self-harm, and suicidality, right? So there's a bunch of stuff here, right? And again, this is all from CDC data. So U.S. teens admitted to hospitals for non-fatal harm. In girls and boys, we see what? Since 2010, a 48% increase for girls, a 37% increase for boys, right? So this could be lots of things. The most common one here would be things like suicide attempts that were unsuccessful, but a lot of cutting, right? Cutting and self-harm in those ways, are things that are definitely here. All right, U.S. teens admitted to hospitals for non-fatal self-harm. Okay, so that's 15 to 19. For those 10 to 14, right? So we're really in a young part, even a little bit younger than we've mostly been talking about in this class. For girls, it's up 108, and this is incidents per 100,000. So per 1,000, sorry. Is that what it says? No, rate per 100,000 of the population, right? So the girls' rate is up 188%, and the boys is up 48%, right? So the girls have increased just a lot more than the boys have, and at a much faster rate. So again, we see it for both, right? Both of these are going up. It's just the girls are going up much faster. Suicide for those 15 to 19, and boys, mostly owing to the type of method they try to use for suicide, is up. What is that? 34% since 2010. Girls is up 82%, but they started from a lower point. And then in our youngest cohort, 10 to 14, boys are up 109% since 2010, and girls up 134%. Okay, now I think suicide is a really interesting and really useful indicator. And there's a particular reason why when it comes to mental health disorders. Because one of the questions that we often face, when we talk about this, and one of the critiques that happens is, is this just reporting, right? You'll get this a lot from millennials and Gen Z, and they will say things like, well, Gen Z is just way more comfortable talking about mental health. So when we see this, huge increase, right, here, that's just that's more reporting, that's a greater comfort with talking about it. And there's certainly probably something to that, right? The Gen Z has a little bit more comfort talking about mental health. However, it's not going to explain the whole thing. And here is where suicide is a really kind of useful and interesting indicator. One of the things that with suicide is it's been tracked by the state for a really, really long time. And it's as close to an objective social metric as you can find, right? Because if someone takes their own life, God forbid, the state has been noting that, and we have records in Canada going, into the 1870s, right? And the U.S. right back into, I want to say like the 1820s in terms of suicide being recorded by the Census Bureau and other authorities, right? So we have these really, really interestingly objective measures when it comes to suicide. We can track it over time because the state tracks it in a really consistent way. And it's not vulnerable to self-reporting, right? You sort of know if someone took their own life. It's pretty objective. So, this kind of increase is pretty notable, and there's not a lot of room for, hey, we're reporting things differently than we did in the past, because we've always reported this particular metric in the same way. Okay. Canadian data, right? So what does Canada look like? So emergency department visits for 13 to 17-year-olds, right? And this is for self-harm, right? So we see the same thing, right? That's our bright line of 2012. Since 2010, girls have increased 128%, 138%. Boys, 75% increase. So, and boys, again, haven't risen as much. Girls, much more self-harm. Canadian women saying that they are in very good excellent or very good mental health. And we've seen this sort of weird inversion, right? So if we go back to 2003, as I said, what a magical time 2003 was. I was young, 21, just met my wife. It's wonderful. Probably spent like 2.5 hours a day with my friends. That sounds about right. Our youngest part of the cohort, right? Our 15 to 30s, right? Teenagers to emerging adults rated their mental health the best out of anyone in, that was being measured. That is no longer the case, right? When we get to 2019, they're rating it the worst. They have the worst mental health, and it's not even close, right? There's been some declines, especially for that 31 to 46-year-old cohort, but this is this steep drop off for our youngest part of the cohort. And it's really kind of interesting, right? Used to be very happy, now are not. And again, we're seeing this sort of flattening of the U-shaped curve of happiness. And then, excellent or very good mental health for Canadian men. Again, it's not as pronounced, but we see young men were the highest in 2003. And again, though the decline hasn't, it's not this like inverted hockey stick graph, right? Flat bit of the hockey stick here, and then the shaft of it, right? This is an inverted hockey stick. That's what you're seeing there. But it's not an inverted hockey stick in the same way, but you still do see a pretty strong decline. And young men are also saying that amongst men, they're the least happy, right? The least likely to say they're in excellent or very good mental health. And again, this is, this manifests in more hospitalizations for mental health. Declines in mental health, especially amongst the young, are more pronounced. All right, the UK, just to say that this isn't just the US. We see the same things. Happiness trends in the UK for boys, right? And this life as a whole, how do they rate their life as a whole? It's a score out of 10, right? It's declined for boys, but it's declined a lot more for girls. They were basically even in 2009. By 2019, 2020, girls are way less happy than boys are. Anxiety, right? Girls risen considerably. Again, 2005 is about here, so 2010 is about there. It's been rising significantly. Boys, same thing, 71% increase. Depression for girls up, 130%, and boys up 60% in the UK. And UK teens, self-harm for hospitalization. Girls, again, big sharp rise from about here. So somewhere in that after the iPhone is introduced era, but taking that really sharp jump, and then boys less, girls up, 78%, boys 134, but the number is still much smaller. And then, Australia, where everything is dangerous and trying to kill you and poisonous, but in terms of self-poisonings, we see a big rise for girls, 15 to 19 especially, and slow but steady rises in all of our other categories as well. Overnight psychiatric visions, good grief, been talking too long, up as well, same kind of thing. Self-harm hospitalizations, again, same kind of thing. We talk about, that yellow line, 15 to 19-year-olds up 45%, 20 to 24-year-olds up more, and the rest, actually down a little bit in some cases. And then psychological distress, which is a weird metric, but we see the same thing, right? Females, 16 to 24, up 75% basically, and males up, kind of peaked out in 2019, but up 55%. And then, way less considerable growth, but still, growth for our females 25 plus and males 25 plus. Okay, and I know I'm crushing you with graphs, but I'm almost done, I promise. and then we'll give you a break and we'll come back and watch a little bit of a documentary. So what do we see here? Oh, this is all fun research. So this is from Pew, and this is from Monitoring the Future. Love Monitoring the Future, by the way. It's one of these really interesting surveys that's been done of young people in the U.S. Since the 1970s. 1976, they did their first wave. So it's a really interesting data set. Okay, so depression scores by, do I have another slide on this? Oh, I do, okay. Because I'm like, do I have my self-derogation and locus of control slide? I do. Okay, so what do we see? There's a political aspect here. And actually, you know what? I forgot to mention this. I meant to add this in when we talked about sex and intimacy, and I forgot. Because there's an increasingly weird split in politics. And I'll just tell you about this. It doesn't matter now, but I'll tell you about it because it's really interesting. When it comes to the kind of males and females, one of the weird divergences we're seeing, women are becoming more liberal socially and men are becoming more conservative. And it seems like in the dating world, it seems to be causing problems because now they have like opposite values and so they can't kind of quite align. Okay, but what do we see here in terms of mental health? Well, generally speaking, has a doctor or healthcare provider ever told you have a mental health condition? Percentage saying yes. Conservatives are the least likely, even amongst our young cohort, to say that. Liberal women who are young are the most likely, just followed by men, right? So if you identify as politically liberal, you're much more likely to report a mental health condition or have been diagnosed by one by a doctor. Okay, and depression scores by gender, right? What we see here as well, though it's not, a huge statistical difference. Female conservatives and male conservatives were somewhat less likely. So the scale runs from 1, a minimum, to 5, a maximum. And basically, female conservatives were at about a 2.2 compared to about a 2.6 for female liberals. Male liberals, were at a 2.5 roughly, and male conservatives were, 2.2, 2.3. So less likely, to score high in depression indexes. There seems to be a political split there. So being politically liberal is bad for your mental health. No, I'm kidding. I'm joking. I wouldn't say that. But there does seem to be something in this political divide that changes the way people perceive things when it comes to mental health. And I'm breaking everything again. All right, I think this is my almost last slide. I'm almost done. Okay. All right, there's a couple other things I'll say here because I think there's something kind of interesting. All right, so when it comes to self-derogation, right, and that is expressing, higher scores on these 4 statements. This is coming out of Monitoring the Future again. So what we see, and again, you can kind of see this goes back to 1977 when they started asking, people's level of agreement with these 4 questions. I feel I do not have much to be proud of. Sometimes I think I am no good at all. I feel I can't do anything right. And I feel my life is not very useful. And the first time I put this up on a slide 2 years ago, a student was like, how did you get access to my diary? I'm like, oh dear, that's not fun. Self-derogation, right? Feelings of low self-worth. What we see is, a really high growth of it. It's kind of a mixed bag in through here, right? We talk about conservative boys and girls. The conservatives are mostly lower on self-derogation than liberals, but basically somewhere around here, like around 2010, sorry, I'm bad at drawing lines, liberal girls and liberal boys jump in terms of measures of self-derogation, right? They start to think much more negatively about themselves than their conservative counterparts. Okay, and then this almost last graph, whenever I try to get ahead, something or somebody stops me, and what we see is the highest scores for liberal girls and conservative boys, right? Roughly speaking, those are the 2 categories that say, there's something getting in my way. Okay, now what is this? Okay, what's that? Is it the matrix? No. it's kind of interesting. Well, when we talk about it, like when I saw this graph the first time, I was like, oh, I know what this is. This is external locus of control, right? So what an external locus of control is you don't feel like you're in charge of or in control of your own life. An internal locus of control is you feel like you can affect your own life, right? You feel like you're in control of your own life. Now, generally speaking, an external locus of control is, oops, what did I do? Go away. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. An external locus of control is more likely to lead to kind of resentment, feelings of anger, feelings of depression and anxiety. Why? Because you don't feel like anything you do can affect your life, right? And so what we kind of see here are an external locus of control most present in liberal girls and conservative boys. And why? Well, I think what probably is sort of happening here is at kind of two different poles. You have sort of social narratives that are telling people that they're not in control of their own lives. And you can think of something like, I hate to bring up internet culture, but think the red pill movement among men, right? And this idea that there are like these nefarious social forces, whether it's like the Soros-backed Open Society Foundation or feminism or some other kind of nebulous thing that is, getting in your way, right? You can't succeed and you can't, no matter how hard you work, you're not getting ahead because there's this external force kind of controlling you, right? So you're going to feel, an external locus of control. Like you can't control your own life, right? It's Biden or something. I don't know. That's the Matrix?
That's what they call the Matrix. Yeah, the red pill community. You can't escape the Matrix.
Okay, I was not aware of that term. I guess that's the red pill, right? Red pill comes from the Matrix. Okay, so that's amongst like more conservative men, right? And people are like, oh, they were red pilled and